Hello, and welcome to the English Language Club. We've got a very special episode today. I'm joined by Jim Johnson from Accent Help. He's got a YouTube channel and a website. Now, Jim is an accent coach, but he doesn't normally work with people learning English as a foreign language, as I do. He normally works with actors who want to do different accents. So, Jim, welcome to the English Language Club.
Thank you for having me, Colin. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what you do. I gave you a little bit of an introduction there, but yeah, tell us a bit more.
Well, I teach at a university. I'm at University of Houston in Houston, Texas, and I teach actors here, both undergraduate and graduate actors, to train them for the professional field. And the focus of my work is in voice, which in theater land means resonance and being able to be loud and, be heard in a large space, but also be able to sound like they are honest when they're speaking. So we're not just trying to get them to sound good, but also to get them to sound like they're a true human being who's saying these lines. And then, and other parts of my work kind of go into what some people call speech work. And I like to just do it as an overall thing about its accents. And so I'll get into phonetics and things like that with my students, but it's all about them being aware of their own way of speaking, but then also being able to change the way that they speak so that they can take on a lot of different accents from all over the world, whether that's native speaker, from different countries and different parts of countries, or it's to sound like they're from another country and their original language is something that's different. Yeah. And so I do that at the university, but then I also, something like 16 years ago now or something like that, started accenthelp.com. And that is training materials for actors. And right now there's over 50 different accents that I have on the site. So part of what I do is I travel around a lot and do dialect recordings, a lot of traveling in my camper van, which I love. And
Cool.
My wife is a dialect coach as well. And so we do that, but we also travel overseas and work there. Both my wife and I coach, and we direct and act with the Prague Shakespeare Company in the Czech Republic. And each summer we do a month and a half long Shakespeare intensive with students. And then in addition to that, I get hired to do coaching for individuals for like prep for movies. And because I'm at a university, I'm not able to go and coach films, but I do a lot of prep work for actors for films. And then I also do a lot of prepping for auditions and things. And then I also coach productions. Like right now I'm coaching a production at the Alley Theater, a New York accent for a couple of actors in a show. And then I'm also coaching some Southern accents, but it's actually mostly about understandability and clarity at the Houston Grand Opera for a production of a new opera that they're doing. So I do quite a variety of
things. You sound very busy.
Yeah, I'm busy enough. Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to have you on is because you do have a very different kind of target audience to me. But we've sort of have a certain amount of overlap as well. But as you were just speaking there, I was thinking, people that want to learn English, people who are learning English, like as a foreign language, it's all about expressing themselves. And I found with some of my students, they say they want to improve their pronunciation, but as we delve a little bit deeper, it's actually more presentation skills and things like that they also want to improve. So I think some of, even though you say you work with actors, I think a lot of what you teach and do has a much wider application to anyone really who wants to, because everyone needs to present themselves in a way.
And I've done a lot of coaching of individuals who are like dealing with English as a second language. And I've also done coaching of lawyers and other people for doing presentation skills. So I've done a lot of that. It's just that basically I've gotten booked enough that I'm busy enough that the focus of my work ends
Yeah.
up being working with actors. And actually, funnily enough, my wife does more work with people who are English language learners than what I do, simply because I at a certain point got so busy and was funneling some work towards her. And now the great thing is her work has actually taken off completely.
Yeah. That's great. We've got a few people watching, and I see a couple of comments coming in. We'll do sort of an interview, and then we'll go back and look through the comments. So Sanidia, thank you for your comment. We'll definitely get back to that. That's a great comment. We'll come back to that later. But keep the comments coming in as we go, and we'll then at the end we'll scroll back through and answer as many as we can. So let's go back a bit. How did you end up where you end up doing this? What were you doing before, or have you always done this?
Running away from the law. So no, actually, the one thing I knew. So I when I was younger, I actually went to college initially for mass communications for radio. And I got bored with it and was really enjoying theater, but I was at a very small school. And so I pursued acting and theater. And then I finished and I was like, I don't know enough. And I went to grad school and learned a lot more. And I still, in many ways, felt like I didn't know enough. But the one thing I knew going in was that I just didn't want to teach. Funnily enough, that was like the door.
So you've been learning a lot about acting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was the focus of my work. And I still work as an actor. But then basically I got started teaching and I enjoyed it. Well, one of the things that I didn't, I'm one of those actors who I don't enjoy performing as much as I enjoy the rehearsal process.
Right.
And so for me, the thing that I love about rehearsing is it's a whole process of discovery. Yeah. And the thing that I found when I kind of got forced into teaching was my work is constantly about helping people to have discoveries. And I love that. So that feeds my soul. And so I ended up rolling further and further in that. And actually the focus of my work, even as a teacher, was about voice work, was like the projection and that kind of stuff. And I only got started doing accents and phonetics and things like that because I went, well, crap, people are probably going to want me to do this, so I better start working on it. And then I put more and more focus on that. And then when I shifted to Houston, we were living in Chicago for many years. And when we moved to Houston, it was just like, that's what the need was. So I kept doing that work. And then because that door kept opening and because I spent so many hours of my day doing that, that really turned into the focus of my work. So I sort of stumbled into it repeatedly.
It's funny, you know, my story's very, very similar. I briefly wanted to be an actor after not performing very well at sort of high school level, and deciding to sort of rebel and decide I'm going to be an actor. That didn't last very long, but it did quickly evolve into sort of wanting to be behind the camera. And so I studied filmmaking, and then and I was working in that around about the beginning when YouTube first launched. You know, I was on there right at the beginning with a different channel. And then it, you know, it got hard. We were doing kind of work that wasn't, you know, doing lots of corporate videos and things for other people that weren't really. I wasn't storytelling, you know, which is what I wanted to do. So, and I've got family in South America, so I decided to sort of take a little bit of a career break, and ended up teaching English. And then it wasn't long before I brought the two things together, and that was how. You know, that I didn't really know much about phonetics and pronunciation until I made a couple of videos about that, because I was working in a place where they had the phonetic chart on the classroom and nobody really understood it. So I thought, yeah, exactly, yeah, a version of that. So I decided to make a few videos on that, and they sort of took off. And so I've kind of been sucked into that through YouTube. So yeah.
Where were you at in South America?
Paraguay.
Great.
Yeah, My dad's from there originally, although his father is from Scotland. So I've got a very mixed, strange background. But
so, do you speak Spanish?
more or less, más o menos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not very good, because I was teaching English. I lived there for 7 years.
Yeah.
I ended up staying 7 years. I didn't really plan to, but yeah, but because I was teaching English as my main job the whole time, I didn't learn as much Spanish as I should have done in 7 years.
Yeah.
But I ended up picking. I can get by there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me more about your website. What is it that I've seen it? There's some. So you've got lots of different packs that people can buy. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I want to say up front that I don't think these materials are not designed to serve English language learners. So
Right.
It's one of those things that I want to be really clear with people. They're really designed for actors who have had to pay like a lot of attention to very subtle shifts in speaking, as opposed to looking for, targeting what is well, one of the ways that I like to word it is we're trying to, and I think this is true for you too, I'm guessing, is we are trying to help people to speak in a way that targets what the listener's ear is used to, so that there's not this block in between where they're trying to translate the strange sound that they hear. Like you had said that about being up in the Empire State Building and saying, is this reduced?
Yeah, my last video was about that. Yeah,
and they were thrown by that. I think that you immediately realize, oh, that's not what your ear is hearing, because it's not what your ear is ready for. And so I do like to think of it like our work is about targeting ears. And so like my work, even with the accents, is for an actor to learn an accent is I want it to be perceived as that accent, and I want it to be perceived clearly as that accent.
Yeah.
And then we've got to be really careful that it's not perceived as something else in a moment, so the audience gets confused and go, wait a minute, it sounds like you're from this other place instead. So we've got to be giving enough consistent messages that it's from a certain place and not from somewhere else. And then we have to be really clear and understandable, because in the end of an actor is not, if they can't be heard and understood, that is like the absolute base of their job. Then I think it just doesn't work. Yeah. So a pet peeve of mine is actors who are really good actors, but who mumble so much on camera that you can't understand what they're saying. So I have some pet peeve actors that are thought of as really excellent actors, but they drive me crazy because we can't understand them so much of the time.
But maybe that's part of the character they're playing.
Yeah, but that's great. But then I feel like they're not telling the story. So I think on rare occasions, the point is, oh, this is somebody we can't understand. But then the story that they're telling is they can't be understood. Whereas most of the time, they're not supposed to be telling the story that they can't be understood. They're supposed to be telling the story that it's this conflict that's happening. And what is this conflict about? And how do they resolve that conflict? It's very rarely about not being understandable. Yeah.
So we often in EFL, English, teaching English as a foreign language, we often oversimplify the pronunciation accents into a British accent and American accent, but in reality, there's a lot more. So maybe we could talk about that, and that would be a good opportunity to hear some of your talents. So if somebody is learning English as a foreign language, how would you describe the accent that they should try to achieve?
Well, I think it is different for different individuals. It's very interesting that you were teaching in South America, because in general, I find that like South and Central America, mostly they are targeting speaking English with an American accent. That tends to be the target. Whereas when you go to most of the rest of the world, the target at least used to be British English. And even with that, I think that what they have been targeting up until very recent years has been the very classic sort of, extreme sort of RP, that very the old school BBC, and now on the BBC, the
Yes.
old, very much the old sort of thing that, now is much more the contemporary sound. That's, something along the line of the way that you speak, which I think is much more like what most of the world is targeting. But it seems like over time, there are parts of the world that are starting to target American speech a little bit more. It's shifting some, but it all depends on the individual.
Yeah.
And, where they live in the world. And I think a big part of that is that they should be targeting the ears that they are aiming for. Like if they are aiming for much of the world, British is more of what they could be, would be, should be targeting. And then it's usually they're targeting
Well, I
something
don't
that's
know. I don't know
London-based.
about that.
Yeah?
Because I think that with most movies and TV shows and music, all of that is American.
And that's where it's shifting.
A lot of it is. Yeah, that's why it's shifting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is. I think it's the media presence that's shifting it. And some of that is because right now it's so prolific with putting out, Netflix. The Netflix is greenlighting everything. So you were hearing so many American voices in so many projects. And then so many other streaming services, but even then YouTube, so much of it is American based, what people hear. And then when we get to those countries, we still have that major breakdown of, well, it's very different in London. And in fact, there's variations in London. The way that you speak is more indicative of the south of England and more indicative of like Londonish.
I grew up in London.
Yeah.
And I think I used to have much more of a London accent. But it's changed as when I moved to South America and started teaching English.
Yeah.
When I started teaching English, I started to notice things that I did that were not, that people didn't understand, that were non-standard almost.
What are some examples of that? Yeah.
Well, it's difficult. I can't really think of anything specific, but I used to speak a lot more like this kind of thing. That was sort of my, although it's very subtle. Like,
so not all the way towards what people think of as Cockney.
No.
But what I would describe, so and this term came up for us earlier, estuary, in the land of estuary. Yeah. Which I like to describe that. So estuary is a term that I think it was 1984 that the term was sort of coined and got used as this sort of greater London, and especially more south and east of London accent that is really having an influence on the country overall. But it is this kind of blend of that old school RP and then Cockney, where they kind of meet in the middle. And for a little while, sometimes people would call it Mockney. That theoretically,
could you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, something along this line. And I like to think of it like, so when I'm teaching my actors that I work with about these variations, I like to work on like this very old school classic RP, but trying to make it very human. So not going all the way to those sort of very, very much and that kind of thing, lords and ladies, but rather going to something that is very classic, but then is also trying to sound human at the same time. And then like going a little bit more. So again, I'm going to focus on understandability. So some people are going to say he's overdoing Cockney. Right, so going a little bit more like towards this, where you're going more for that like East End of London or more parts of London do that now, because Cockneys can't afford to live in the land of Cockneys anymore. And then
so my voice growing up was a step towards that a little more than it is now. That's very interesting.
And then in that land in between, I like to think of it as a dimmer, where estuary is. So you end up with like contemporary RP, something along this line, that does have elements of the estuary, and then you come more to the middle grounds of estuary, and then you go to something that's a little bit more like, it goes a little bit more towards Cockney, but it's still got, I like to think of it as it's got this curvilinear intonation pattern, whereas the Cockney's got a little bit more punchy and broken up sort of thing.
You reminded me then of Michael Caine, the Michael Caine kind of accent.
So Michael Caine was South London, which is not technically Cockney, but it's got almost all of those Cockney elements present in it, the classic Cockney elements. And I see somebody made a comment about, but London multicultural English is replacing Cockney. And what I'd say is, I don't think that it is. What I will say is, I think Cockney is becoming less common because they're being driven out. Now I can't remember what the suburb is, but the last time that I was in London to get dialect recordings, I was getting some in like Bethnal Green area, which is like classic Cockney neighborhood. But mostly it's not Cockneys who live there anymore. It's mostly estuary speakers or speakers from all around the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of immigration into those areas.
Yeah, it's just they've gotten priced out mostly. And they've gone to, I can't remember what the suburb was, but like I went to a suburb further east, and that's where I was finding more recordings in that direction. So I think it's not that it's being replaced, but it's changing a bit. It is probably getting a little bit estuaryized, in addition to the fact that it's moving locations a bit. But what multicultural London English is, Essex, somebody mentions in the comments there. It is heading in the directions of Essex, and Essex is one of those that has some of that estuary sort of sound in it. It's becoming less like distinct, like, oh, this is the way they speak here, and this is the way they speak here. And it's kind of blending into that. And then multicultural London English is not replacing Cockney, but it is an accent that sort of finally got a name, I think, in the early 2000s. And some people called it, in the same way that estuary was sometimes called Mockney, some people have called multicultural London English Jaffacan, because it's got some things that are a little bit more like this, where it's like a mixture of the Cockney, and it's really Cockney and estuary meeting. And then some of what I have been hearing, and I'm not an absolute expert on individual ones. I have a smattering of a lot of information, but it is becoming like a mixture of Cockney and estuary, with elements that seem to be indicative of either Caribbean or English as a foreign language, like the big indicators being the O and A, which for both estuary and Cockney go more towards O and A. But for some of the earlier MLE speakers, and still some today, it's more O and A, which is more like, say, Jamaica, right? The O and the A. Or it's more like most EFL speakers throughout the world, that they go towards O and A as the default sounds for those, what you and I both think of as, in our own speech, as diphthongs, as this vowel movement that happens. And even that I've heard shifting more, that more people are being like described as an MLE, multicultural London English speaker, but they have more of the estuary elements coming in. So it's changing, and they all change over time. And then old people lament that the language has gone to hell. And it's just that language always changes. Yeah.
So AJ's just said, is there a way to sound more posh? Maybe we can talk briefly about that, and then let's move west and talk about some different accents, and then obviously we've got to talk about some American accents as well. But we'll need to move fast, because we could do this all day, but I know that time is limited. So
well, the posh that's being brought up, I think this is, I threw some terms at you that are just like, I don't expect like my students or people I work with to remember these terms, but I think they're really useful concepts for actors, at least. And I like to use them at least as an initial groundbreaking in this. And so, well, we talked earlier about maybe talking about accent versus dialect.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that. So we'll come back to that question,
so then,
AJ.
So then Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we
So
talk
one of
about
the one
accent
accent,
dialect then?
yeah. Another accent I'd like to talk about is the West Country, because I used to live close to Bristol, well, between Bristol and Bath, and yeah, there's an accent there that they have, and I used to describe it as kind of a little bit curly. They
Yeah, right.
sort of talk their words a little bit curly like that.
Yeah, well,
Kind of
they
thing.
keep the R's on.
Yeah.
So English accents used to be almost all rhotic, where they said the R's after vowels. And that was like pre-1750. Almost everybody did that. And then what happened is it became more and more non-rhotic. So around the late 1700s.
So what do you mean by rhotic for people who don't know?
Sure. So rhotic, like my speech in general is rhotic, while your speech in general is non-rhotic. And this is what a lot of people say, that you drop your R's and I say my R's. Well, we're both saying a bunch of our R's.
Yeah,
It's
when people have said that, it's always confusing, because it's like we are saying them. It's just we're saying them a little differently.
Yeah. And another point that I try to make with people when I genuinely have some time with them is we're both saying even post-vowel R's. Your R after a vowel is different from my R after a vowel. So if I say rare, and if you say that word in your own accent,
rare.
So some people would say you don't say your R's. Well, we both said an R before the vowel. And I said an R after the vowel, rare. And you also said an R after the vowel, but your R isn't realized in the same way my R is.
Yeah,
and that's what people commonly say is not an R, or you dropped an R and it's non-rhotic.
Yeah, so R is an interesting consonant, because even though on our sort of phonetic chart it has one symbol, it's very different. You know, the R is very different to or you know. So it's I think it deserves another symbol. Almost.
Well, and in fact, it does. It depends on like the version that you look at. There are a whole bunch of R symbols because they get realized in different ways. But even when you look at the kind of expanded chart that shows all these details, there's a bunch of R's that don't even exist on that because there are so many, almost infinite variations in those. So when you get to the West Country, that tends to be a rhotic accent, and they say their R's, and that's that curly. Right then, Harry, so Hagrid is the classic example that I try to refer everyone to. That tends to happen there,
right?
Or even tends to happen there,
Mm.
Or I always like to think of the Wurzels, why you've got a brand new combine harvester, I'll give you the key. That R.
Yeah, and then as you move further south, I remember seeing there's sort of a relationship or an evolution as you go from like Bristol down to Cornwall. It's sort of something gets stronger, or it gets even more rhotic, maybe.
Yes, and that's another one that's changing over time, and therein lies part of my challenge. Is being an American, there are some elements of British accents that I have a lot more trouble perceiving, simply because I don't have the history with them that so many people from England do. That for me, the subtlety of some of them is more challenging. And I'm not helped by the fact that more and more speakers from Cornwall and Devon are non-rhotic, that they're dropping their R's, because that is the primary mode of speaking in England in general. So it becomes really challenging to differentiate some of that for me.
Right.
Because partially because it's not as distinct as it used to be. People move around a lot more. Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of, over the last century, there's been a lot of homogenization of accents. I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Before radio and television, there, I think that when they started to broadcast and everyone was listening to the same thing all the time, that started to make everything move towards that, and we lost a lot of that variation.
And so much of the early broadcasting was in England was aiming for that RP, Standard British, like that BBC defined. And it wasn't until the 70s that they started to loosen it up and go, hey, people can actually speak a little bit more like wherever they're from. And that was just
Yeah.
the beginning of it. It really didn't kick in until much
And
later.
yeah.
Yeah.
So let's carry on. Let's carry on looking at some other accents. Let's move west a bit further into Wales. How's that? Because that's a very distinct accent, especially when it's very strong, and an accent that possibly somebody from London might struggle to understand somebody with a very strong
and I
Welsh
think,
accent.
and even that can vary depending on the what part of Wales they're from, how much Welsh is spoken, and their family and their education and that. So the Welsh accent, so something along the line of the Welsh. So the biggest thing that tends to stand out to people is, to me at least, what I hear from people that they really perceive in the Welsh accent is the sort of musicality of the Welsh. And that is the Welsh accent. If I'm going super like cartoon version of it, it is that sort of bounce. And that's a non-rhotic accent. That then so for a non-rhotic speaker, if you say, well, we both said rare, and then you say rare, something more like that. But if you say it's rare if, do you mind saying that phrase? It's rare if.
It's rare if.
So your R comes back in to go into if, and so that's that linking R that carries, or I said your R comes back in, and earlier I said you still say an R, but the R that we perceive as an R comes back in. And with a Welsh speaker, the stronger the accent, the more likely that's a tap. So it's rare if.
So is there a slight roll in there? Rare if?
Yeah. It's almost like a trill or a slight roll or a tap or a flap, it's commonly called. Which is if we think about Spanish, or if we went to Scotland for a moment and we think about what a lot of people perceive as that trilled R, like that's great, that great, that most of the time isn't actually a trill. It's that same kind of tap or flap. But that trilled R, like in Spanish, is the word for dog, perro, when it's the two R's, versus the word for but or however, pero, where it's just a single, it's like it's a single R as opposed to a trilled R. That tap is what tends to happen for the Welsh speakers. And that happens so much for Scottish speakers most of the time too. Even though people describe it as a trill, a lot of the time it's a tap.
Now it's interesting you mentioned that sort of musicality and rhythm of Welsh, because I've had students that have said to me that people tell them they need to slow down, and I think again that's an oversimplification, because what's more important that they need to do is get that rhythm right, which is speeding up and slowing down. So it's not that they're going too fast; it's that they're just keeping it. They don't have that rhythm. I think English is very rhythmic, and we use a lot of weak forms and strong forms in order to accentuate the most important parts of what we're saying. And
I like to describe it as cycling. We've got to cycle our way through the way that we speak. But what we kind of want to do, or I also like, especially with actors, I need to work with them on being able to slow down the words that are important. And then also, it's almost like they have to mumble the words that are not important, the words that are not important. And then they need to
not
elongate.
The words that are important. The words that are,
Because if you make everything really stressed, or if you make everything mumbly, they're both sort of equally hard to understand. Almost. The mumbling sometimes is harder to understand, but the differentiation.
When you've worked with actors and you're doing Shakespeare, sort of the term iambic pentameter comes into that a lot. And isn't that to do with the rhythm and the musicality?
It is, and it's the whole didum 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 didum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. That kind of didum da 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 da. And I used to, so I do teach a lot of Shakespeare and work with a lot of people coaching Shakespeare and perform in it and direct it and all that. I used to do what I think most people do, which is teach iambic pentameter right up front. And now I prefer to teach it way later, because I think most of the time, I think it screws people up when they work on iambic pentameter too early, because Dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? They start to obey it too much. And what they need to be
Yes.
saying is, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Instead of,
Yeah.
shall I compare thee to a summer's day? But I'm still doing it. I'm just going, shall I, shall I, shall I? It's just, those are milder. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? But people, when they really learn that, they get too locked into it being like a marching band.
Yeah.
And right
And then it just
now,
sounds unnatural.
yeah. And American speech in general, we do too many stresses a lot of the time when we're speaking. We're punching far too many words. We would actually be clearer if we didn't stress quite as many words, but instead sort of cycled our way through them a little bit more like this. Yeah. And it's that rhythm that you're talking about that's so important.
Yeah. I think that's,
Yeah.
and that is a characteristic of English as opposed to other languages, I think.
Yeah. Do you talk a lot when you're working with somebody? Do you talk a lot about strong form and weak form?
Yes. And in some ways, I mean, well, when I'm working with people that want to improve their pronunciation, I do. But most of what I've been when I was teaching in classrooms, I don't do that so much now. It was all just grammar and vocabulary and that kind of thing. It wasn't. So this is going a little bit deeper into the pronunciation, which is what most teachers probably don't do so much. So I have done that a little bit, but I'm not. I'm still learning myself to an extent. So,
but I would imagine it's something that you almost instinctively, at least, would probably do just when working with an individual. Like if you're doing individual coaching, I bet it's something that comes up all the time because you recognize someone is overworking speaking it, and you go, okay, we got to work on weakening some of those words because right now all of the words are strong, and it actually makes you harder to understand.
Yeah. So in terms of like the very basics of like weak forms and strong forms, talking about that, and this is why I was saying how when people are told to slow down, that's an oversimplification. This is where I think we need to bring in the importance of rhythm and using weak forms and strong forms to kind of squeeze the words or squeeze the important words onto the beats of that rhythm.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And the thing that I find that my students in general do in their own speech is they elongate. So most of the time people go up in pitch and they go louder when they're stressing something. And in their casual speech, I find that my students are also elongating words as they're getting descriptive with something. But then when they start acting, I have to really work with them to remind them to do that elongation. They just kind of want to make everything happen at the same level, and then they struggle to really make sense of what they're saying. And it's also because, like I mentioned, some of what I'm working with them on is like ownership of the language and of the words that they have to say that someone else wrote for them. We have to work on how do you say that word and you own that word in that moment. You have to find almost the onomatopoeia of that word. How do you make that word sound like what you mean by it?
Like it's just a natural expression of a feeling and an emotion, because that's what language is really. Or
you're trying to put it's almost like you're trying to put baggage on that word to mean the idea that you're trying to express. And that's what oftentimes gives it the elongation and gives it a life. And we need that life in the language for people to be truly expressive. But
and I tell, when I'm working on this with students, which I haven't done a huge amount, but when I do, I tell them to, use your hands, think about your facial expressions. What are your eyebrows doing? Even though this is not really, that sort of thing doesn't come into teaching English as a foreign language, as very, you won't find much of that in textbooks by Oxford University Press or anything, but it is very important if people are trying to improve their pronunciation, or at least be understood, make themselves understood and express themselves. It's very important to use. It's not just about the words you say and saying them clearly.
Yeah. And
there's a
I
lot more.
also love to use gesture and physicalization in all of my training with people. So we just mentioned with each other briefly, like about placement and intonation. When I'm working with someone on placement, that sense of where the sound lives in the mouth, I'll have them like, bring your hand here to try to feel like you're drawing the sound there. So whether it's
Yeah.
your
Now,
hand demonstrating it or lips or something like that.
can we talk more about this term placement?
Yeah.
Because this ties in a little bit with AJ's question, how to sound more posh, and it's something that I definitely want to talk to more. So, what? Just so that people know, what exactly do you mean by placement? Because I think this is probably the most important thing to think about if trying for someone who's got let's say someone who's learning English from India, or and they can speak English fine, but they've got a very strong accent and they want to work on that. I think placement is the most important thing to think about. So what is placement and how can we improve it?
Well, I do like to say placement, in some ways we could look at it like it's BS, right?
Right.
But I find that there's a huge payoff from believing in it and looking at it like it truly exists. There are people who also describe it as mouth posture or oral posture.
Yeah, because this is why I wanted to ask you about it, because it's so difficult to explain what it is, because it feels like where the sound is coming from in the mouth, but it's not.
Absolutely.
But
almost, it could also feel like where you're sending the sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not really, the sound isn't actually coming from there. It's just where it feels like it's coming from.
Right. Because the origin of the sound is at your vocal folds here. But then what happens, so the way that it gets described in voice land is we have the source of the sound, which is the vocal folds here in the larynx. And then they go through a filter on the way out. The filter is partially about resonance, the bouncing of the sound. Because when we create sound at the vocal folds, it's really, really quiet. But then as it echoes around in this space, it gets louder. And it also brings out certain tones of the voice. So this is very similar coming through that space. And this is me changing the shape of the space. And I didn't change much of anything else.
It's a bit like an old gramophone, whereas the vocal cords would be the actual needle touching the record. But placement is the shape of the cone where the sound comes out.
And you change out the cone on that gramophone, and that gramophone's going to have a different sound. One of the things I say to my students that makes a lot of sense to them is I say, we're trying to change the bowl that you put your phone in when you're trying to play some music. Like if you put some tunes on your phone and you put it into a coffee cup, that's a very different sound from putting it into this metal bowl versus this great big wooden bowl or something that's got a different shape to it, a pitcher. You change that. That's what the resonant space is. And that's a huge part of what we mean when we say placement is like, what is the bowl that you're putting your phone in for to bring out, accentuate certain elements of the sound.
So could you give us a bit more of an example? How would you describe the difference in placement between a sort of New York accent and a Boston accent, or for example, or any other?
And actually, potentially, they're not hugely different from each other. Those two, it depends on the individual. Right. If we even just go with New York, so there's an old thought that, this is a Brooklyn accent and this is a Bronx accent and and they've actually, some studies have shown this not actually accurate, that there's not a distinction necessarily between the boroughs, but the distinctions are actually probably more about people's cultural backgrounds. But the sort of old stereotype is that like the Brooklyn, which we could also say is a little bit more like that Italian sort of Brooklyn thing. It is a very like open resonant space at the back, but then the focus of it is down low right here at the front, almost like if you stick out your fat lower lip, like I punched you in the lower lip and it sticks out a little bit, that tends to bring out what people describe commonly is that Brooklyn-esque sort of sound. Whereas if you go more high and flat and wide, and this is not as open, that's a little bit more that sort of Bronx stereotypical sound. That's that somewhere that's green. If anybody's seen the what is that, Little Shop of Horrors, Yeah, that
Right.
sort of
Yeah.
thing. That is that. So you get, so you can get those differentiations, or even if we go back to London for a moment, that more posh, old school RP, very high and forward, but with a big open space here. And then we go down to like a little bit more Cockney-esque, is still open at the back, right? But it's got a lot lower sort of placement. And then the estuary, that kind of middle ground's a little bit more in the middle of the mouth instead. So you get some
But
things that
what?
are
But
a
when
bit
you
more and
say in the middle
aren't
of the
as
mouth,
open. Yeah.
when you say in the middle, what exactly do you mean? Because is it your tongue in the middle of the mouth, or this is what I'm struggling to explain to students.
Exactly. And this is why I think that we can, like I can say Brooklyn is low and forward with his resonant space in the back. But then I need to hear a student doing it so that I can go, okay, that's not working for you. Let's shift the way that we're describing it and find it. So what I'll do is, in working with somebody, what I really commonly do is I go, we try a number of different things, and I go, don't feel like because something we do doesn't work that you're doing it wrong. It's just, it's not working in this moment. The language I'm using is not doing it, so maybe it's my fault and not yours, and it doesn't matter. We're going to try something else. So we do some experiments in that sensation of it, and then I'll go, okay, what did you just do? Describe to me what you did. And I want them to use their language. And then sometimes
So you're getting them to experiment with the shape of the mouth, the position of the tongue.
Yep.
And do you literally tell them to do that, or is it?
Yes.
Are you talking about the sounds?
Yeah. I work
one
with
thing
them
I say
on shifting it around. Yeah. There's a really wonderful speech training course that I'm so grateful for its existence, even though I haven't formally taken any of them, but it's called Knight Thompson Speech Work, KTS. And the thing that I love about it is it's the kind of stuff that I've been teaching, but some people have really worked on it and expanded it in some other ways than what I would have even thought of. And I worked with both Dudley Knight and Phil Thompson, who originated that work. I worked with them before they kind of created KTS, and both just really brilliant, amazing humans, and generous humans. And they and people who followed up with them have created this work. And what I love about that work is they do even more experimentation than I necessarily do. The challenge with it is it takes a good deal of time through the degree of exploration that they're doing. But if you have the time to do it, it's phenomenal. Like when I'm coaching an individual, we're kind of cutting to the chase and going, we need to play around. And now we identify something and go, great, you just did it there. Describe to me what you did. And then sometimes I will repeat their language back to them, and I will maybe offer up some other words, and they may go, oh, that's more the word. That's the word I was looking for. And that little descriptive, and I don't care if they say, well, I made it more purple in the back. If that makes sense to you, and that means that tomorrow you can find purple in the back again, then I'm good with it, even though that makes no sense to anyone else. As long as it's
it literally doesn't make sense, but it sort of gives the right kind of.
But I want them to find the language for it as much as they can, or I want to see the ding ding when I offer up a variation on the language, and I can see when they light up and they go, that's the word that I'm looking for to describe it. Then our challenge is, okay, now it's 3 days later. Can you find the purple in the back again? And if they can't, then it's like, well, okay, so maybe purple isn't your word. We need to rediscover that until it's something that can become really, really accessible to you. But there is a shaping that happens in here, but it's
a sort of neutral. Maybe would it be accurate to think of it as like, what is your to change your kind of neutral mouth position in terms of roundness or unroundness, where your tongue goes when you're not moving it somewhere, and how, like you mentioned about the jaw being further forward on with the kind of Brooklyn accent. I think you said
it could. I would focus more on the lip going forward,
right? The lip, yeah. So maybe if somebody wants to work on their accent, it would be good to kind of remodel a different neutral position?
Yeah, yeah. And I want to get away from neutral because I kind of think there's only neutral in theory, because I will also say there's a really popular voice book, and it's got phenomenal work, and I did years of training in it. The Linklater work, which her first big book that was popularized, is Freeing the Natural Voice. And I really hate that title personally, because I want to say that I don't think anybody has a natural voice, but I like to say habitual voice. And then I want to work with people to go, well, this is your habit. Don't tell, well, this is what I do naturally.
Yeah.
No, this is what you do habitually. And I don't think that I can guide them to what is natural, because I don't know what that is. And it may not serve the work that we're trying to do, because we're trying to do work where, like for me, with working with stage actors, we have to work on being able to resonate in potentially a massive space and have intimate conversations, which is not natural.
No.
And so we're trying to build a new habit that serves whatever it is that they're targeting. And we want to be able to build a habit that can become more of a new default, a new neutral, but I'd rather say a default. And then we also want to be able to, because I work with actors, we want to be able to go away from that and go into other things, because we're trying to develop other elements. But a technique
for doing this, for people that want to establish an accent for their English, maybe is something that I've heard you talk about before, is an anchor phrase.
Yeah.
Where you sort of focus on just one phrase and getting that phrase right, and then it can sort of grow from there. Would that be a good technique for people to use?
And I will oftentimes do that when I hear someone speaking and I go, boom, you were right on with this phrase. And then what I'll have them do is say that short phrase and then say something else, like immediately. Like I was mentioning to you earlier, this summer I was coaching an actress from Scotland, and she needed to be able to do an American, a sort of neutral-ish, I like to call it generican. She needed to do sort of a generican accent for a play that she was in. And it was something water bottle. Maybe it was purple, something like that. That was purple water bottle. And then she'd say a phrase from the script, purple water bottle. And then she'd say another phrase from the script. And when she would do that, it would get her into that mode, and she could feel what it was like to operate in that mode. And then we want to be able to drop away that anchor phrase, but it's a way of like anchoring in the sensation of that mode of speaking. And I think a huge part of that is placement, but then it also becomes intonation. I find intonation and placement, depending on the individual, are the big things.
Right. So tell us more. What exactly do we mean by intonation, then, as opposed to placement?
A sort of looser term for it is musicality, which can be about rhythm. And we were talking about that earlier, really, when we were talking about the cyclings, for everybody's sake, to clock that we were talking about intonation then. And so it can be the rhythm in which somebody speaks. It can be the variety of pitch that people go to. And the fact that there are some accents where they actually, like, they don't go up to stress a word. They'll actually go down to stress a word.
That's a sort of Irish accent.
Yeah, heading up towards more Northern Ireland or into Dublin or something like that. So that sort of scoop that happens with that. And that happens with many Caribbean accents, and that happens with many accents of Central and South America. You'll hear that. It also happens in what a lot of people think of as an American sort of drawl kind of sound, whether it's like a West Texas sort of drawl, or even just around the Rocky Mountains, they tend to do something that's not quite as strong. But that sort of drawl element that exists in some accents is almost like you press down in order to stress whatever it is that you're going to go into.
Yeah, well, but in most accents we stress up. I guess I just did there. But that was more because I was asking a question.
Well, and I think I like to think of it almost like it's a tiny rainbow. Like in most accents we stress up, Now you have certain elements of estuary, which estuary sometimes stresses by going ever so slightly down, and will very often go curvilinear, a curve in order to stress something. It moves in pitch in a way that may actually be that slight dip or drawl for a lot of estuary speakers. And the sort of cartoon of estuary is Austin Powers. Yeah. Right then, baby, that sort of thing, which is way over the top cartoon.
Yeah.
But finding that helps for a lot of people who need to work on an accent that's got that dip or drag. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes maybe trying to impersonate something like Austin Powers or Hagrid, or, you know, it could be a good way to develop that kind of anchor phrase.
Yeah.
Which then sources that would then work as the seed for the rest of their accent.
Right then, Harry. Now I can speak that way because
if that's what they wanted to do, but on that, let's talk about Australian accent, because that's got a sort of thing at the end which makes everything sound like a question, even when it's not.
Absolutely. Yeah, that and that's something that I think, I mean, it's really hard to track this. Again, I'm not an expert at it. I know enough to do some coaching, but I think that's something that's become more and more common over the years.
Yes.
That, like that Australian sort of like a lift at the end of something, where it becomes a little bit more like what some people would perceive as a question. That's also like that Southern California, like surfer dude or valley girl, like totally. It's a lot of people call it uptalk. So that Australian sort of rise, where it goes up at the end of something, that absolute lift.
What I think it is, I don't know if you've heard this theory, is that it's in the UK in the sort of 80s and 90s and now not so much, but still now we had a lot of Australian soap operas. In
interesting!
The UK.
I didn't know
and
that.
I think, and it's during that time, you know, mid late 80s to 90s and noughties. That has grown in and become more prominent, and I think it's because of the soap operas. Australian soap operas like Neighbour. It was one called Neighbours and one called Home and Away. Those are the two big ones. So
do you feel like it's something that you hear more and more in England, or you did at least at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's not super common.
Yeah,
but it's you do hear it a lot. It's like, I think it's sort of found its place within normal British accent. It's not
it's present in some of them, like there is some of that in the Welsh that can have some of that, or like the Liverpool, that sort of Liverpudlian sort of lift that you can hear from someone that gets into that same kind of thing. I
definitely do it myself sometimes, and I think I do it more now than I did. I mean, I was very young but I think it's because of soap operas.
And I think I hear it more, something in that direction. I hear it more from younger people in general. And there are people who I think it's mostly old judgy people who say that it is
they hate it. Yeah.
That it's it's uncertainty, that they don't want to say anything certain. So they make everything a question. And I'm like, I don't know that it's uncertainty. I think it's just a mode of operating that they get used to. And
I think it is. No, there's something in that.
Judging again.
No, but it's when you want to say something, but you don't want to say, I think this, as in this is my opinion and I'm right. You want to say, I'm considering this as an option.
Yeah.
You know?
But it's also a way that we communicate that we're going to, I've just been working with a couple of my classes on this, of continuing the thought with how do we, because one of the things that happens for a lot of American speakers is, this happens so much with my students, is they put in periods everywhere. And so it's almost like I like to call this the American clunk, where it clunks all the time. Or I like to think of it as crashing the plane. And what I need to work with them on is not crashing the plane over and over again, over and over, but then, right? And I want them to land it instead of crashing it. And in fact, I want them to work on being able to continue it by lifting, and I want them to be able to continue it by sort of continuing steady, and I want them to be able to continue it by even going down in addition to finishing. But finishing with certainty instead of finishing with a clunk, where oftentimes the last word goes into vocal fry, that kind of crackly voice thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is just not having enough airflow. Vocal fry is not having enough air flowing through the vocal folds. And so then they meet irregularly. This is my understanding of it. They meet irregularly, and that's what results in that sound. Yeah.
Interesting. So, yeah. So things like this Australian up talk could be a way of indicating. Well, yeah, but we normally use it at the end of a sentence, like when we are stopping, even though it's not a question, but we are inviting feedback.
Yeah, I think that we will. I was thinking that this might be a good idea. Please help me, so that it can be an invitation for, and also indicating that, well, my thought is not complete, but I have an opinion of this moment, but I'm not ready to say, oh yeah, that's okay. So let's do that. Okay, so let's do that. That still sounds like I'm uncertain about whether we'll do it. Yeah.
That's great. So look, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I want to invite people now. We've had a few questions, and we have actually answered some of them. But if you've got any questions, please do get them in now, and we'll try to answer as many as we can before we have to finish. But let's see. Are there any we haven't commented on? So Beatrice on Facebook has said, "I'm surprised the way I can understand Jim without watching his face." So that's. But yeah, I can understand how people would, being able to see someone and watch their.
Oh yeah.
Because it's not just about what the words we say. And this is what I was saying earlier. And actually, in my notes from watching some of your videos, I've noted down that you've written plucking and gesture-like, or I've written plucking and gesture-like conducting as things that you've mentioned in your video, in some of your videos. And I talked about that, how we using your hands to help make you understood.
I preach that constantly, doing a physicalization. Like if you're trying to get someone to bring their placement higher and more forward, doing even a physical gesture or trying to open up the back, putting a hand here oftentimes helps that to happen. In addition to doing something like sticking out a lip that draws them in that direction, and the intonation, I'm constantly asking people to do this. And one of the things that I kind of want to do all the time when I'm coaching somebody virtually is I almost want to mute them and just watch their gestures and go, and then unmute them and go, I don't think you're doing the intonation right, because I see your gestures are going the other direction than what we're targeting for this accent. Yeah. It is interesting that how much the physical can inform it.
Yeah, well, I say in my videos all the time, pronunciation is physical. If you're struggling to pronounce a word or a sound, then you think about what you're doing with your tongue and your lips. And when you break it down like that, there's really only quite a small number of elements to think about. You go unrounded round. And actually, my next video, which is coming out on Sunday, is going to be about the vowel sounds and how really, in some ways, we talk about there being 5 vowels because we've got A, E, I, O, U, the 5 vowel letters, but really there's 12 vowel sounds. But really, there's an infinite number of vowel sounds because
it's getting into the charts, where it's, and because even when we look at like all this overwhelming number of symbols for all these different vowel, this is the vowel chart of the phonetic alphabet. And even when we're looking at that, we're constantly, much of the time, we're doing something that's kind of halfway in between different things. We're not actually doing that specific sound. We're doing something that's in between somewhere. And so it absolutely is an infinite number of sounds.
Yeah. So that, and the way to, because I had a comment from somebody saying, "Oh, how can I remember? Is there a good way to memorize all the vowel sounds?" I was like, well, really, there's only two things to think about: how rounded or unrounded your lips are, and how closed or open your mouth is.
Yeah.
And if you
how
just
far
vary
forward
those,
or how far back. Yeah. You know what? There's a great, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of J.C. Wells.
No.
So John Wells is a linguist from the UK, and he in his first book, Accents of English, Volume 1, it's a 3-volume set. But in his first one, he's trying to set up the fact that he's going to talk about accents. And what he does is he came up with a lexical set list of words just to be able to talk about the different sounds that happen in different accents. And I remember reading somewhere, I think he said, man, if I knew that people were going to, glom onto this, I would have thought more about the words that I chose. But he's got words like fleece, kit, dress, trap, bath, graph, to describe, and more words than that to describe all the sounds, like fleece and kit. For many EFL speakers, words like fleece, they commonly do something pretty close to that sound. But words like kit, most EFL speakers are taking it towards the fleece sound. So they don't say kit, they say something more like kit.
Yeah.
For many EFL speakers. And so the nice thing is with his lexical set words, like he's got bath or he's got trap and bath, and the recognition that in my speech, those are the same sound, trap, bath. But in your speech, do you mind saying those two?
Yeah. Trap and bath.
Yeah. Depending on the individual in England.
Yeah. But some people will say bath. So a lot of people will say bath. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have there's another YouTuber called, her channel's called Pronunciation with Emma. I think she would say bath because she's from the north.
Yeah. So some people will say trap and bath, and some people will say trap and bath, and they're the same, pretty close. So it depends on the individual and the accent when you get a subdivision like that. Like there's a section of it that I like to call Hell's Corner, which are, I adapted his words a little bit. I use father instead of what he uses as palm. But like father, lot, cloth, thought. So here's a distinction between New York and Boston, for example. New Yorkers will go father, lot, cloth, thought. And somebody from Boston will go father, lot, cloth, thought. So they group those 4 words differently. And whereas your speech would mostly be father, lot, cloth, thought.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Lot, clot. What was it?
And thought.
Thought. Yeah.
Yeah, which is the most rounded one. And for you, lot and cloth are basically the same sound. Whereas for me, I say something more like lot and then a slight rounding on claw. It's a slight difference. For a New Yorker, it's big. Yeah.
I remember a while ago hearing about this sort of survey that someone had made, where it says, it gives you a word, and then it says, do you say this word to rhyme with this word or this word? And then there's another question, and then by the end of it, it tells you where you're from. Have you?
Yeah.
Do you remember that? I don't remember what it was. But
I do remember that, and I can't remember what that was. But absolutely, there is that tendency that if you say them in this way, they can start to narrow down where you're from. And I have to do that sometimes when I'm listening to somebody and I'm trying to figure it out. Although it always bugs me when people are like, "Where am I from? Tell me where I'm from." And I'm like. Unless you're doing like the strong indicators of somewhere, I'm not necessarily going to be able to tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there is a little bit of a card trick in that, a little bit of a magic trick. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Great. So Frank Gonzalez has put his hand up. I don't know if he wants to ask a question, but anyway,
maybe he's just waving at us.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can wave back. Hi, Frank, and hi, everyone. We've got a dozen or so people watching, so please give us a thumbs up. And we've got a couple of minutes left, so if there are any final questions, we can get them in, and we'll.
Something I kind of mentioned earlier that I never quite got into are these terms that I'd love to just clarify, which is acrolect, basilect, and mesolect, which are really way more complicated than they need to be. But generally what they're used for is to describe, so like if we look at Australian accents or South African accents, very commonly they'll describe them in three sort of categories as like cultured Australian that sounds very much like Standard British in many ways, or RP. So that more cultured Australian versus like a very broad Australian sound. That very broad would be the more cultured would be the acrolect, whereas the broad Australian would be more the basilect, whereas the way that most people speak is the mesolect, that's like in between. And you have that same kind of thing that happens in South Africa, but I think it happens everywhere.
So what is that scale? Is that like a scale with those?
It is. I think it's a useful concept for people to have, because like someone brought up about being more posh. Well, most people are not quite like basilect. They're not doing like Cockney would be considered maybe a basilect accent of London, whereas something more RP would be considered the acrolect, perhaps. But the way that most people speak is more that estuary sound that's a bit more the middle road, and that would be the mesolect. And so realizing that very few people are at those extremes, actually, typically, unless you're in a very insular community. If you are in a small East Texas town, then it's very likely, and most of the people who are there were born there, it's very likely that you're going to have something more in the direction of a basilect. Of a strong version.
Do you mean that different accents can be grouped as being in different places on this
to
scale?
Some degree? Yeah. And like in the States, I would say the acrolect is what I call generican, is this sort of neutral generican, what a lot of people call no accent, right?
Yeah.
That's the no accent American. And that's that acrolect. And then you've got the basilect, which is like, oh, you're from Chicago, like you got that really strong Chicago sort of sound to you, right? So if somebody's from there, they might dub bears, doubles, that kind of thing, right? So that would be that really strong one. But most people from Chicago, they don't actually talk like dub bears, doubles. They actually are doing something that's a little bit in the middle, where you can hear certain elements of the Chicago thing kind of coming out, but they're going a little bit more in the direction of that generican kind of sound. And that's where you hear like, well, I'm not absolutely sure where you're from, but it's in the direction of that. I can't, it's a mixture of the strong localized version or cultural version and the more neutral, as people like to call it, that I can't tell where you're from accent, other than roughly the country or the continent. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we are running out of time. It's coming up to 8 o'clock here.
I'm glad Frank got to raise his hand, though.
Yes. Well, we'll have to do this again sometime, because it's been really great, and there's a lot more we could talk about, and I'm sure I'll get lots more questions in the meantime coming up. So if you want to follow Jim's channel, it's Accent Help here on YouTube, and his website is accenthelp.com. And if you want to join the English Language Club, make sure you are subscribed and give this video a thumbs up, and head on over to my website, englishlanguageclub.co.uk/join, to stay up to date with all the other stuff I am doing and I'm going to be doing soon. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.